Welcome, everyone. I'm Mike Cohen. I'm the director of the Graduate Program International Affairs, and it's a real pleasure to welcome you here this afternoon. This is a special event for the GPIA and for the New School because when we think about international affairs and we think about problems, it's not often that that programs decide to really focus on the condition of children, to think about children's rights, to think about children's poverty, and it's really a tribute to the leadership of Alberto Minujín that we have worked together here in the program and at the university on the question of children. I don't know if all of you have been in this room before, but I think this is also an appropriate place to talk about social justice and poverty and deprivation. These wonderful murals of Jose Clemente Orozco were done in the 30s, were originals. And over here we have the struggle in the East, the struggle in the West. In the back we have the worker comes home at the end of the day, and behind the screen are the table with the heads of the great religions. But this is always kind of a place which reminds us that the discussions about social policy and poverty and equity fit within a broader context of the history of struggle. And so sort of in that spirit, we're having the event this evening. We have many distinguished guests today. I'd like to thank Richard Berry of the Children's Aid Society, who's joined us and will speak later. And I'd also like to recognize Christian Salazar, who joins us from UNICEF, my colleague Sanjay Reddy from the Economics Department here at the New School, who's worked on poverty and inequality questions for a long time. Two of the co-authors of the book with Alberto, Solrun Engelbertsdottir and Kristen Lewis, are also here, who will share their perspective on child poverty, inequality, and inequity. I think it's fitting also that the panel represents a range of organizations and perspectives on this problem. Also, it's something we cherish in the context of our graduate program. Partnerships really matter, how things fit together, and it's not always that one perspective has the answer to the problem. We certainly know that. I think I've said in this platform, behind this microphone, a number of times we've learned, and certainly in the last 3 or 4 years, that the economists don't have the answers to all the problems. Pardon me, Sanjay, but anyway. Anyway, so in a sense, today's event, the presentation of this book on global child poverty and well-being, measurements, concepts, policy, and action, really represents the best in terms of theory and practice that I think that the New School and our graduate program is proud of. Alberto has co-authored this volume. We think it's groundbreaking in its treatment of these issues, covering a wide range of issues, from the issue of measurement to conceptualization to what actually happens on the ground. And I think it's also significant that Alberto himself embodies the idea of both theory and practice, and he's very involved in these issues through the Equity for Children website, through other activities in various countries. And so it's a particular pleasure to honor you today in your presentation of your book. The Equity for Children website, which is a clearinghouse for information about child poverty at a global level, is also really important. I think, at least for the younger generation in this room, you know the power of it. The rest of us are learning about how websites and networks really work. But I think that getting this information out to a mass audience in a friendly way is really very important. And so we're really delighted that this is another activity that fits within the program. So this evening, we're going to have a panel discussion. Alberto will speak first, and each of the people who I'll introduce thereafter will speak for about 8 minutes. So we'll try to keep it moving along, and then hopefully there'll be some room for some time for questions and comments, and following that we'll have a reception. So I'd like to welcome Alberto and
Thank you.
Make the first set of remarks.
So thank you very much. Thank you very much. Let me put the presentation. Can you do it? Yeah. Sorry. Well, thank you very much to all of you for being here. Thank you, Mike. Thank you to all the other people in the panel to be in this launching of the book. I'm very happy of doing this. It's a sort of celebration of the book for me. And it's, for me, it's important to do this here in the New School and here in this Orozco room with this, surrounded by these things that are very, I think that very moving and calling for something. I'm very happy because I think that with this publication we are adding a first discussion and debate on child poverty. I think that is probably, in this moment, is the most update and probably one of the best times that we put together all the concepts, how to measure, but what is important, what are the policy implications, and what are the actions that we can do on child poverty. But I am even more happy of being with this panel because the idea today is to discuss about child poverty, global child poverty, and what we can do. And so I will try to keep my time as all the others so we have time for the debate and the discussion. But let me start telling you, I want to tell a brief story that is in some way is the origin of the book. At the beginning of the 2000, I think that was 2001, by the end of the last century and 2000, poverty was back in the agenda. Yeah? But what poverty? Adult, basically income poverty. And here Sanjay Reddy has wrote a lot about that with Tomas Poggi. But in that time I was in UNICEF. Yeah? And we were trying to come up and say, look, children's poverty is very important. Not too much attention to us, let me say. I went to a conference of, was a meeting of experts in Lisbon, I think that 2002, and I brought a paper, I presented there a paper called Making Child Poverty Visible. And the argument there was very, very simple. Now we are much more sophisticated, but the argument was, look, most of the poor are children around the world. And in the developing world, most of the children are poor. So, why we are not discussing that? Let's put that in the first row. But one of the big problems that we had in that moment, that we didn't have numbers. We didn't have evidence. We came up with some numbers. I don't want to tell you how we cook the number. We cook a number and we can show in that, but we cook at the number. There in Lisbon, there were, Peter Townsend was there. Sir Peter Townsend he died very recently, 1.5 years ago, was really a very committed person. He worked for a long time on question of poverty. He has this long debate about relative poverty with Amartya Sen. And we were walking there, and I said to him, I challenged him, I said, let's measure child poverty. Let's do something. Let's do something multidimensional. Let's be out of income poverty. And I look at Sanjay that can talk a lot about that, no? And he catch that. He said, okay, let's do it. And from there, it came one measure, multidimensional dimension on deprivation, that is what now Solar will talk about that in the global study. So we have a measure on child poverty deprivation. However, working on that kind of things, we also ask what children think about poverty. And there were a series of studies talking with children using participatory approach. And this is only a quotation that it said, I feel bad. I feel like the odd one out. You lack self-esteem. So for children, for adults, material deprivation is a basic thing. For children, it's material deprivation, but also certain things related with everyday life, related with this kind of discrimination because you are poor, you are another religion, you are different. Being different is something that is very complicated. So we really think that for measuring and looking and doing something, acting on child poverty, we need to look at two different kinds of inequities. What we can call vertical, that is the thing that with material deprivation we used to look, that is to say income difference, access to basic social service. That's one kind of thing. But there is another big part that is related with horizontal, that is to say people that maybe has a similar income, but one group is discriminated and not the other. Yeah? And that makes huge difference, and the impact on children is very serious. And the problem is that usually these things overlap. It's not that you have one and not the other. Overlap and make life much, much more complicated. So we came with a conceptual framework that tried to combine these dimensions, thinking on material deprivation, exclusion that is related with these horizontal inequalities, and what we call vulnerabilities. We know that many children, if something happens, the first that suffer with crisis, different kind of crisis, it could be work, it could be economic crisis, the ones that suffer more are women and children. So how much the society is ready for that, we came with that as a framework. So for finishing, let me say a few things about some of the strong message in the book that you can find in the book. I will summarize in few seconds like 500 pages of book. So not an easy thing, but the messages are very clear. First, in the book you can find proven methodologies to measure child poverty in a multidimensional way, basically from the quantitative side. On the qualitative, we also have discussions, and we think that we need to give voice to children. There is one of the papers very interesting about South Africa, where they ask children and they ask adults about what is poverty and what is the basic and more important needs, and they compare one with the other. Very interesting results. So qualitative, there is a methodology proven in quantitative side, qualitative side. Children must be there. The third message is that it's doable, absolutely doable. Look, I'm putting there the examples that are, we have from developed countries, Europe, USA, but we have Tanzania, Congo, Vietnam, Haiti, Latin America. So almost all over the world you can measure. No doubt about that. From the point of view of the policy, you will find there in the book also many of the cases. They show how putting the evidence and discussing with the government can change the agenda in a very effective and clear way. So no doubt that evidence can impact the policies and policies can impact the evidence. That is to say, practical thing and empirical things are together with theory and all together go to policies. The other thing that is clear from one of the studies, that is the Young Life study, that they study the impact of the crisis, economic crisis on children, is that we need to protect, in any case, vulnerable groups. Economic growth is clear that it's not enough. We need to do much more than economic growth in order to protect and to move this in another situation. And the other thing that there is a lot of examples is that we need an holistic view of the question of child poverty, and local action mixed with broader policy, it seems that is the way of moving in this direction. And finally, one of the paper in the book, one of the chapters is about Peter Townsend that is proposing what is called an universal child benefit. And he showed there that we can have that all around the world. There is some examples in some countries around the world that are doing that. That is to say, a child benefit for children because they are citizens. So it's a good start and it's a way of doing. And he showed exactly how to do it. So this is the thing that are in the book, that you can find in the book. And finally, let me say that child poverty, the point is that currently is the world's biggest killer in this moment. Every day, poverty is killing children, women, and families. In this century, it's unbelievable that so many children don't have water, diet before the year of 5, don't have drinking water, don't can clean, all the things that we know that happen. So this is not inevitable. I think that we can act and must act in favor of children. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Alberto. I'd like to invite Soran Ingilbjornsdottir from UNICEF.
Now I need to find the presentation, if someone could help me. Thank you, Michael, and good job of pronouncing my name. You almost got it. In short, it's Sola. So I'm from Iceland, so in case you didn't guess. First and foremost, I want to congratulate Alberto on the book.
Thanks.
I know it's been a long process, challenging at times, but the end product is very promising. Together with my former colleagues at UNICEF, Gaspar and Sharmila, I have a chapter in this book where we reflect on the global study on child poverty and disparities. It's a very big initiative, and I have very limited time today, so I hope I'll manage to get across some of the main messages. The global study on child poverty and disparities was initiated towards the end of 2007, and initially it was in 39 countries, but since it has expanded to 54 countries across 6 continents. And for this chapter in Alberto's book, it was the first time that we actually got together and reflected upon the process since the launch of the study, and tried to be impartial, take a step back and evaluate the whole thing, although of course we're all heavily biased since we've been heavily involved in the whole thing from the beginning. So, why did this come about, this study? UNICEF staff who are traditionally very familiar with a project approach to development have traditionally struggled to get a chair at national policy tables where ambitious midterm expenditure frameworks are laid out and strategies for poverty reductions are launched. And for these reasons, UNICEF headquarters launched the Global Study on Child Poverty to assist its frontline country offices in upstream policy engagement. And the initiative was launched and expected to generate evidence, insights, and networks that can be used as leverage to influence national development plans. So the first step, of course, was to conceptualize what is child poverty. And as Alberto pointed out, we can date all this work all the way back to at least the year 2000, when he and other colleagues at UNICEF emphasized and highlighted that poverty reduction must start with children. But really, the 2005 State of the World's Children, which is UNICEF's flagship publication, was the first time that it was pointed out that there's no clarity or consensus on the definition of child poverty. And the publication, which in some ways is a precursor to the global study, provided this definition of child poverty, which is children living in poverty experience deprivation of the material, spiritual, and emotional resources needed to survive, develop, and thrive, leaving them unable to enjoy their rights, achieve their full potential, or participate as full and equal members of society. Now, this is a very beautiful and comprehensive definition of child poverty. And then the challenge, of course, is how to move from this abstract definition of child poverty to something that we can implement and measure. So the study methodology is largely based on a method developed by, inspired by Peter Townsend in some ways, and developed by David Gordon and his colleagues at the University of Bristol, among them Shaila Nandi, who's a co-editor of the book with Alberto. And this methodology looks at child poverty in 7 dimensions, and it relies on household surveys. I'm not going to go into the methodology today, because as I said, I have very limited time. We can discuss that later on. From the onset, the study took the form of, you can say, a franchise of sorts. It had standardized terms of reference, templates, and guidance provided to field offices from New York. And in each country, there was a team of national researchers, there was statistical offices were involved, and then a UNICEF focal point. And today we have 31 reports produced on child poverty, and these are national reports, and 2 regional reports. But what I mostly want to talk about today is the impact of the study. And first and foremost, the study has been successful in bringing national partners together in many countries for the first time to discuss the issue of child poverty. And in some countries, the study has reached highly impressive goals. I just listed a few of them up there. For example, in Mali, the study led to the first national forum on poverty, which in turn led to the formulation of an action plan on social protection. In Morocco, the study led the government to officially adopt multidimensional child poverty indicators. So these are just a few examples of the impact of the study so far. But one of the most important parts of the study is, like I said, to get national governments together to discuss the issue of child poverty. And participating countries themselves identified as a crucial element of conducting a successful national study is that from the beginning, the study needs to be conducted in a participatory manner, a study that is solely developed by a research team without wider consultation reaps limited benefits. And from the beginning, you need buy-in from relevant government ministries, including a focal point within each ministry. And lastly, the composition and reputation of the national research team is a key factor in conducting a successful child poverty study. The case of China is a good example of how it's very much about the process of conducting a child poverty study. It's not just about having a nice report at the end of it all. It's about getting people involved to discuss child poverty. And just so you have some context about China, It's estimated that 12.7 million children under 5 in China are stunted, and this is the equivalent to approximately the entire population of Zimbabwe. So we're talking about very large numbers there. So UNICEF, UNICEF China, is part of the Global Study on Child Poverty and Disparities, and they collaborated with the State Council to reduce child poverty, and this was a very long process, a lot of advocacy work. And at the end of it, last year in 2011, for the first time ever, child poverty was mentioned as a distinct problem that needs to be addressed. It can't be lumped together with adult poverty anymore. And child poverty was mentioned and included in the 10-year National Rural Poverty Reduction Strategy. So this is an example of a process where you get people together to discuss child poverty. Now, where are we now? National analysis continues. And like I said, we're at a time where we're reviewing the foundations of the study and thinking about the way forward. For example, whether we should be doing more of a global analysis of multidimensional child poverty, because so far it's all been very national-led processes. Should we be looking at alternative approaches for middle-income countries or countries that are conflict-hit and fragile states? Should we be looking at child-centric income poverty? Part of the study is looking at child deprivations of basic needs, but somehow in all of it, income poverty has been forgotten. Should we be looking at the different needs of children across the life cycle? Because as we all know, the needs of a 2-year-old child is not the same as the needs of a 17-year-old child. So that's another thing to think about. Subjective well-being, Alberto touched upon that before, and that's something we haven't done enough of. Emotional well-being, empowerment, do you feel satisfied with your life, and so forth. And a lot of advances have been made since the study methodology, which was approximately in 2000, they started thinking about it. There's been advances in household service. For example, the latest round of multiple indicator cluster surveys, which UNICEF does, there was a whole module on life satisfaction. So that's something we need to tap into and think about. How can we more measure these things, subjective well-being? Should we only be looking at one measure of child poverty, or should we be, to get a comprehensive overview of child poverty, should we be looking at different sources and so forth? So my time is up. I apologize for that. I just wanted to leave this up because we also encourage countries to do qualitative studies. And this is an example from the Bhutan study, where they showed in the study that 23% of school-age children are severely deprived of education. And they accompanied their analysis with qualitative study. And if you read this paragraph, such a paragraph often says a lot more than numbers. So thank you very much. And again, congratulations, Alberto, on the book.
Thank you very much. Now I'd like to invite Kristen Lewis, who's the co-director of the Measure of America of the Social Science Research Council project.
Great. Okay. Thank you. Thank you so much. And I'll reiterate the congratulations for Alberto. So today I'm going to say a few words about child poverty in the United States and how it's currently measured. And then I'll share with you our preliminary thinking about a better way to assess well-being of very young children and why we think doing so is so important. So in general, the U.S. massively underperforms in child well-being. And one way of understanding this is to look at income poverty. So while the U.S. average family income for households with children under 18 is 6 times higher than the average for 30 OECD countries, child poverty rates are among the highest, with more than 1 in 5 children living in a poor household. So if we're looking just again at income, we see that there's been very little progress since the late 1970s on child poverty. In fact, children are more likely to be poor than people of all other age groups. So 22% of children are poor, compared to around 14% of working age adults and just 9% of the elderly. the elderly are actually the group best protected today from extreme deprivation in the United States, thanks to universal entitlements like Social Security and Medicare. So you can see in this graph, until the mid-1970s, the elderly were actually the most likely to be poor, and today they are the least likely to be poor. So clearly progress is really possible when we put good policies into place. And note here that the last major period of economic expansion in the mid-2000s was not accompanied by a substantial decline in child poverty. So that rising tide did not lift at least the littlest boats. In 2010, children under 18 were 24% of the US population, but were 35% of the total population living in poverty. So here's a map that shows the U.S. by congressional district and shows child poverty. So the darker colors represent higher levels of child poverty. And you can see quite clearly how much greater child poverty rates are in the South and Southwest. But surprisingly, right near us are the country's highs and lows in terms of child poverty as measured by household income. So New Jersey's 7th congressional district, that's northern New Jersey, and includes parts of Hunterdon, Middlesex, Somerset, and Union counties. Child poverty is just 3.4%. So that's 1 in 30 kids is living in a household where the income is below the poverty line. Right nearby, just a couple miles north of us now, is New York's 16th congressional district. And that has the country's highest child poverty rates. So 53%, more than 1 in 2 kids living there is living in a household whose income is below the poverty line. So that's the story that income tells, and it's a pretty dire story. But we would argue, as Alberto eloquently did at the beginning, that using household income and traditional poverty line to measure children's well-being is quite inadequate. So income poverty measures, the poverty line, is outdated. It's extremely limited. Basically, it's based on a formula developed in the 1960s that was tied to the price of food. And it doesn't capture all the other ways that the U.S. underperforms when it comes to children. So the U.S. lags behind the other OECD countries in terms of low birth weight, infant mortality, preschool enrollment, and educational outcomes. So just one example, the U.S. incidence of low birth weight children is the highest in the OECD countries except for 1 or 2. It's 8.1, so that's double the rate of Iceland, Finland, Sweden, and South Korea. Another thing about income poverty is that it doesn't capture hard to measure yet critically important areas for the well-being of young children. And 2 of those that we'll talk about a bit later are protection from harm and emotional attachment. So if we can't use income poverty as a proxy for well-being, what can we use? I have the answer. It's human development, okay? So the purpose of our project as the Measure of America is to move beyond income as our chief way of assessing well-being and progress. We really wanted to introduce to the United States an idea, human development, that's been very successful around the world in broadening the way in which people understand and measure and track people's well-being, moving from strictly economic measures like GDP to a measure that captures some of the other things that expand our choices, opportunities, and freedoms. So to do this in the United States, we introduced a modified Human Development Index, which we call the American Human Development Index. So for those of you unfamiliar with human development, basically the traditional approach to progress asks, how is the economy doing? And the human development approach asks, how are people doing? It's really about enlarging people's choices and opportunities, improving their well-being. It's rooted in Amartya Sen's capabilities framework. And it's really the global gold standard. It was pioneered at the United Nations, and now it's used in about 160 countries to assess their well-being. So the idea of human development is very broad, but it's hard to measure something so broad. So the Human Development Index, basically the global one and ours as well, measure 3 areas of well-being: health, education, and income. So we modified our index for the US to make it more relevant to the context of an affluent democracy. And we use basically life expectancy at birth, educational enrollment for everyone 3 to 24, and educational attainment 25 and up, and then median personal earnings, so your wages and salaries from your own labor. And we basically add those 3 together, and we divide by 3, and we get a score, and that's your score between 0 and 10. So the problem with the Human Development Index in terms of measuring children and children's well-being is that most of the indicators really are focused on adults. So for instance, the educational attainment indicator is the highest degree you've attained by the time you're 25 and up. The adult education, the income indicator is median personal earnings for 16 and above. Young children don't have earnings. Nonetheless, we do think that the Human Development Index is better than the poverty line in terms of assessing well-being. And here you see there is actually a very strong correlation between the Human Development Index and all sorts of things, a negative correlation with child mortality, child poverty, infant mortality, and a positive one with early childhood enrollment, and a lot of other kind of good things. So you'll see here the light colors represent lower levels of human development, and you'll remember that those are basically the same areas that were dark green, high for child poverty. So this is helpful, but it's not really enough for measuring children's well-being because adults and children experience poverty and opportunity really differently. And rich literature attests to the particular salience of child poverty, especially poverty in the early years. So why are we so concerned with young children? Basically, some of the most challenging deficits we face in the country today are really symptoms of problems that occurred in early childhood. And deep and persistent poverty in the preschool years is associated with a host of negative outcomes from low rates of high school completion to lower college-going rates, incarceration, and a host of other things. So what we proposed was an index that builds on the human development framework and rests also on the capabilities framework of Amartya Sen, but it introduces two new things. So all human beings share certain basic needs, and those are well captured by the three areas of the Human Development Index: health, education, and income. But then in addition, young children have a set of additional needs. One is for protection, and the other is for attachment. So young children's need for protection from harm is far greater than that of other age groups. They're small, they're comparatively helpless, they're unable to defend themselves. But also the impact on young children of damaging environments and so forth really sets them on a lower trajectory for their whole life. And just one more minute, which is the second thing is attachment. You know, attachment is critically important. It's really the way in which children understand the world is through a loving relationship with an emotionally responsive and appropriately stimulating caregiver. So that's another tremendously important thing for children. So we would argue basically that attempts to assess the well-being of children under 5 are needed, and that they should look at both the basic building blocks of human development for everyone, as well as these additional indicators, protection and attachment. And the question of what those indicators would be is a bit tricky, and we're happy to talk about it later. Thanks.
Thanks very much. That was great. I'd like to invite Richard Bury from the Children's Aid Society.
Thank you. Can I talk from here? Or do I
Sure,
need to go up?
sure. That's
I don't
fine.
have a PowerPoint, so I can. Good to see you all, and again, congratulations again, Alberto. And
Thank you
really,
very much for
not to repeat everyone else, but really a remarkable achievement. Not only measured by the number of pages in the book, but just a remarkable achievement. Exactly. So I want to, and that was a great presentation, by the way. I sort of want to follow up on what Kristen talked about, focusing really on New York City, primarily, and the challenge of overcoming childhood poverty in a place like New York City, the scope of the problem, why it's so difficult to overcome, and what are the prospects for change. So I think in a lot of ways what Kristen's talking about, and what all of us have been talking about, comes down to the idea of the American dream. And this is a basic idea that where a child ends up in life should not be determined by where he or she started life. So it's a fundamental building block of our democracy. And for most of our history, it of course has never been true that where you started life did not impact where you ended up. It's always mattered. But in a lot of ways, the story of America is the story of that becoming less and less true generation by generation. What is alarming about where we are right now as a country is that we are in the place for the first time where it seems like that forward progress may no longer be taken for granted. First of all, we know that America had the most intense income inequality that the country's experienced since we've been measuring it. In fact, it's at the upper end of the spectrum as compared to most industrialized Western countries. But even extreme income inequality, as terrible as that is not necessarily inconsistent with the idea of the American dream. It's not inconsistent if a child born in deep poverty has a chance to escape their poverty through life. But what is in some way even more alarming than the high incidence of income inequality in our country is that social mobility is at its lowest rate, as it's been in 30 years, as measured either by the amount of a child's income that can be determined by the income of their parent, so that children are more likely, born in poverty, are more likely to grow up to be poor children than they were 30 years ago, and are more likely to have poor children themselves. So the challenge that we're talking about is, it's a challenge, of course, about material needs, but it's also a fundamental challenge to the state of our democracy, to our values as a country. Kristen talked about some of the alarming poverty figures here in New York City, and of course, absolutely right, the child poverty measure, the poverty measure as measured by income, is woefully outdated. But even by that limited measure, we know that nearly 1 in 3 children in New York City are poor, about 520,000 children. And we know that there's a disproportional racial impact to that. So here in Manhattan, a black or Latino child is 10 times more likely to be poor than a white child. And poverty, one of the reasons why your paradigm of human development is such a rich way to think about this is because poverty, of course, is about more than lack of income. It is a system of challenges that stand in the way of young people reaching their full potential. So it's not just that you and your household don't have enough money, it is that you also, if you don't have enough money, probably don't have enough food to eat, or at least not food of high quality. And you're living in an environment probably where you have substandard housing, and you probably attend terrible schools, and probably your role models that you experience are not where they need to be. And you experience violence and exposed to violence on a regular basis, and you're exposed to abuse. It is this almost perplexing to imagine the amount of obstacles, daily obstacles, that impact just the regular existence of a child living in the pink houses in East New York, Brooklyn, or in the South Bronx. One of the ways in which this complexity of poverty becomes so bedeviling for us who are trying to address it is that the systems that we have in a place like New York City and in the country to address poverty are just woefully outgunned in their ability and their structural ability to solve those problems. The best way I can describe it is by talking about a young woman who I met, a mom who I met when I first started working at the Children's Aid Society 2.5 years ago, as I was trying to learn about our work, and I went to visit one of our former clients, who was this woman named Marisol, who had 3 children, and her family had just been reunited after 6 years of being in the child welfare system, of being in foster care. And Marisol had been a victim of domestic violence. Her English was not strong. She was homeless for a while, which is what initially triggered her children being taken away from her. She had really been through hell and back, but had finally been in the position where her children were being returned to her, thanks in part to her incredible hard work and to the support of the Children's Aid Society. So I'm sitting with her in her living room in the Bronx. She was living with her boyfriend and these 3 kids in this apartment in the South Bronx, and she was happy, of course, because they'd just been back together for about a month, and I asked her, what are you worried about? And her answer is that she was worried about everything. First of all, her kids still attended terrible schools. She was unemployed with no real meaningful job prospects. The city had a program called Advantage, which is the housing subsidy program for formerly homeless individuals, which at the time the city had just announced were about to be cut, and which have since been cut. And without that income lifeline, she had no backup. She was at risk of going back into the homeless system, which of course put her right back at risk of entering the child welfare system. And what was so perverse about this whole situation is that because the family had gotten back together, the children were no longer at risk for safety. our funding to work with the family had ended. So basically the child welfare system's engagement with that family was over. But sort of any rational analysis of this family would suggest that this is where the work starts, not where it ends. That now, once you've gotten past the immediate crisis, now's where you start to build the building blocks of long-term success and attainment. But we, in fact, had our funding end, the case is over. And this is a situation, this is the way that we as a society deal with poverty. You know, there's a lot about the way that government is set up in America that makes it very difficult to engage complex issues like the issues of children living in poverty. One is that, you know, as a society, we're attuned to short-term cycles. The election cycle's short-term. That leads to looking for things that have short-term results, but the things that we're talking about are not short-term intervention. This family didn't need just a short-term intervention of the child welfare system. This family needed a long-term engagement. It also means that we have a system which is geared towards addressing emergencies as opposed to supporting prevention, as opposed to prophylactic measures. Another big reason that government is hamstrung is because in many communities, particularly communities of color, the distrust between communities and government is so strong that it becomes difficult, even when government is at its most well-meaning, to be an effective support. Government's also very fragmented in the way that it provides services to children. This family must have dealt with at least a dozen different public bureaucracies just in New York City to get basic supports, whether it's around food stamps, foster care, education, and these are systems which are really and truly disconnected. And unless you work in the system every day, it's hard to really imagine how disconnected they are. The ways in which the Education Department does not talk to the Department of Youth and Community Development, does not talk to Health and Human Services, does not talk to HRA, et cetera. Government is also very risk averse, which means that innovation is difficult. Because clearly we haven't figured out how to solve these issues, yet government is a place where it's very difficult to drive innovation. Because, and even exacerbated, I think, by the gotcha political environment that we live in today, because no one wants to be on the hook for investing a lot of money in a social change policy that didn't work. It's also difficult to redirect resources once they're institutionalized. So once a government program or an intervention becomes part of the DNA of the system, thank you, it's almost impossible to redirect it. Just as an example from our own work, one of our best-known programs is called the Queer Adolescent Pregnancy Prevention Program. And it's a program which has been shown through randomized controlled trial to reduce teen pregnancy by half in the young people who participate in the program. That's a program that we've run for 25 years solely with private financing, because for that entire time, public funding for pregnancy prevention at the federal level was limited to abstinence-only programs, billions of dollars spent with no impact. It's only in the current administration where the Obama administration decided to do something interesting, which is to say, let's actually try pregnancy prevention programs that actually work. We now have two major funding streams which we're using to replicate this program nationally. But we spend hundreds of thousands of dollars a year on lobbyists just to fight that appropriation, because you can imagine what's the first thing on the list of public cuts. The pregnancy prevention program, which talks about sexuality as though it weren't a sin, and which offers things like birth control. So there are all these structural reasons why government is not well equipped to solve these problems on its own. And yet, and if I had more time, I'd elaborate more, nonprofits, and I obviously run a nonprofit organization here in the city, the Children's Aid Society. Nonprofits, we have a lot to offer because we don't have many of those constraints. Yet the ways in which government and foundations engage with nonprofits to support our work undermines our opportunity to do well. Restrictions on funding that lead us not to be nimble even though we could otherwise be nimble. Restrictions on programs, restriction in the amount of money you can spend on what's called administrative overhead, which is really things like research and development and rent and innovation, which you generally can't do in public contracts. We find ourselves locked in a system that makes it very difficult to move forward. So here in New York City, I mean, there are reasons to be optimistic despite those challenges. One of the wonderful things about the last decade and the current administration is that whatever you think about the current administration's policies towards children, it is an administration which has been willing to take chances and which has created lots of opportunities to approach this work in different ways. At the same time, we live in a city that continues to experience real challenges despite those opportunities. Academic achievement continues. Academic achievement gap between the rich and the poor, between whites and minorities, continue to be a significant challenge. So I'll leave it there. I hope we can have more time to talk during questions. And again, I want to thank you for creating this opportunity to talk about these important issues and to be a part of the conversation. So thank you.
Thanks very much. That was really a very important perspective into this whole conversation. I'd like to invite Sanjay Reddy to offer some comments.
If it's all right with you, I'll also sit here since Richard has initiated that.
I try to be a trailblazer.
You have been. Well, first of all, let me also join in appreciating Alberto and also the others here for their involvement in this project and these issues. It's really very inspiring and extremely important. I think that it's easy to forget if one is involved with an organization such as UNICEF or perhaps the Children's Aid Society in some way, that these concerns, maybe it's not easy to forget in the Children's Aid Society or UNICEF, but these concerns are very much more marginal in the world, in the public discourse, than they should be, and most people don't think about them very much. And that is very disturbing. That's one of the reasons why we have the terrible situation that we do. I just came from a conference in Berlin on new economic thinking. And one of the things that was striking there to me was that almost all of the so-called new economic thinking was about issues relating to regulation of the financial sector, financial stability and instability, the role of stimulus, whether stimulus works. It was all about macroeconomic aggregates. There was very little concern with the question of human beings, how these aggregates affect human beings and how that in turn affect the macroeconomic situation and prospects of a country. Amartya Sen spoke during the conference, and he made a remark which was, I think, highly controversial there. He said that John Maynard Keynes was not one of his favorite economists. And since many of the more unorthodox economists there, or the left of center ones, view Keynes as a hero, that didn't go down very well, I think. And his reason for saying that, however, is interesting. He said that Keynes did not have as broad an appreciation of the concerns of human societies and of the things that matter in human lives as certain other economists whom he admired, such as Adam Smith. And this occasioned a very heated subsequent informal debate among the participants, including some of my friends who were there. And one of them pointed me to a passage in Keynes's Economic Consequences of the Peace. And it's a long passage, so I won't read all of it to you, but I'm going to read a little bit of it just to demonstrate that even John Maynard Keynes was very interested in human beings, and in particular in children, at least to an extent and for certain reasons. This is Keynes describing the situation in Germany in 1919, and he quotes from various writers of the time. And in particular, he says the following. He writes, quoting a German writer, "I visited large country districts where 90% of all the children were rickety and where children of 3 years are only beginning to walk. Accompanying me to a school in the Erzgebirge, you think it is a kindergarten for the little ones. No. These are children of 7 and 8 years, tiny faces with large dull eyes, overshadowed by huge puffed rickety foreheads, their small arms just skin and bone, and above the crooked legs with their dislocated joints, the swollen pointed stomachs of the hunger edema." And then he goes on to describe a particular child, and he says at the end of that description, "Yet there are many persons apparently in whose opinion justice requires that such beings should pay tribute until they are 40 or 50 years of age, in relief of the British taxpayer." It's ironic and interesting that Amartya Sen made exactly this critique of the current approach in Europe to dealing with peripheral countries, and in particular with Greece, that the effect of the really extraordinary cuts in public finances in Greece will be to affect the prospects of young people and of children. The idea that young people and children should be protected from some of the worst impact of such fiscal austerity at a bare minimum, if austerity is to take place, which is not a new idea, certainly in the world of UNICEF, is one which is really not part of the European public debate. There are lots of debates, lots of discussions about how exactly to deal with Greece, which are in relation, again, to the macroeconomic aggregates. How much relief should Greece receive? What should be the schedule of repayment? But they're not directed at this question. And so it's very interesting that, contrary perhaps to Amartya Sen's description of Keynes, Keynes did take this issue seriously. Now, he doesn't, of course, elaborate on exactly why it's important, but I think it's clear enough that the reason that it's important, reasons that this is important are twofold. They have both to do with the intrinsic immorality of prioritizing the concerns of the presumably much more affluent British taxpayer over the concerns of such children, and because of the implication that the long-term consequences for the productivity of the society and for all social goods of this type of inattention or indeed criminality, fiscal criminality, are very substantial indeed. Moving back to the book, I really am very impressed by the way in which it has managed to bring together a range of concerns, to bring together country studies and a very detailed and rich contextual analysis of local situations, and much more general conceptual discussion, which is cross-cutting and indeed universal. The way in which the book bridges the concerns of child poverty as they appear in developing countries and in developed countries is, I think, very powerful and important. And we see that also in this panel. It's really very disturbing to see the ways in which child poverty remains at a very serious social problem in the most affluent countries of the world. Of course, with somewhat different dimensions and aspects than child poverty in developing countries, but nevertheless so. The article by Pemberton, Gordon, and Nundy toward the beginning of the book, chapter 2, I think makes a very strong case that one cannot adopt a merely technical or technocratic approach to this question. That ultimately it's a question of public attention and public awareness. And it also requires a contextual interpretation of what is going wrong and why. And so they recommend a process of periodic audits of each society to determine to diagnose what exactly are the reasons that child poverty has the particular dimensions that it does in a society, and to help to understand what are the interventions which can be most pertinent, most effective in a given situation. This proposal, I think, is an excellent one. It reminds me also of an essay by Tony Atkinson called "Why Britain Needs an Annual Poverty Report." He's not discussing child poverty there, but poverty generally. Certainly the same argument applies to child poverty, perhaps even more forcefully. Poverty in general, and child poverty certainly in particular, are invisible for a variety of reasons in societies in which there's very little media or political interest in bringing them to the fore. Governments don't rise or fall on social questions generally, and certainly not on questions related to poverty. So that there should be some institutionalization of the process of assessment and also of diagnosis of policy choices that have been made and how they have contributed or not, or detracted from, that is to say, from the goal of reducing poverty generally and child poverty in particular, is something that's very important to do. The article by Ruth Levitas is another that I especially found valuable and enjoyed in this, which I also commend to. The article is chapter 18 is called Utopia Calling, and in it she describes the ways in which really the policymakers, so-called policymakers, even those who are explicitly charged with or have committed themselves to addressing issues of child poverty, set modest goals for themselves. And indeed, in their internal reports, keep making those goals more modest in order to make it easier for themselves. And she discusses this specifically in relation to the career of New Labour in Britain, and demonstrates that the powers that be and the think tanks which influence them in thinking about social policy and child poverty in particular eventually began to propound more and more the message that it was just too expensive to try to get rid of child poverty altogether, and that therefore one should settle for something less. This, of course, is also resonant with the message of Keynes. I don't have any time left. I think there's much more to say, and certainly I haven't had a chance to talk about the measurement issues, which are very interesting, which have been raised by Solrun and Kristen. I think there's a lot, especially to talk about with respect to the contribution of UNICEF and of the Bristol group, which was involved with UNICEF in producing this book, and the earlier State of the World's Children, which pioneered the global child poverty estimates, which were published by UNICEF. I think that UNICEF and the Bristol group, under the leadership of Peter Townsend and David Gordon and others, really deserves credit for being the first group or organization in the field of development generally to really bring about a global multidimensional poverty assessment. I don't think they've received as much credit as they should, because the UNDP's approach to that problem has become better known. But I think that they were the first to do it, and they did it in many ways very well. I have my own reasons for thinking that they did it better than those who came after them, and that there are many reasons to prefer the approach which is championed in this book. But we can certainly talk about that later. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Sanjay. Now I'd like to invite Kristen Salomon.
I'll go back to the beginning and speak from there, if that's okay?
Please.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. Actually, I join really my colleagues here on the panel in congratulating everybody involved with the book. In a way, this book is a quintessence of know-how on child poverty measurement. And I really think everybody, not only involved in the book, but the networks also around this, have really contributed new knowledge to the world in the understanding of child poverty. So really that's something I think that will last and that will be recorded in the generations after us, that this is really an important new moment in time that this book somehow reflects in very good quality. As a discussant, first I'm very grateful for the invitation. I just would like to, I mean, I read that book and I read it with the eyes of what to do with all of this. I mean, what's next? So I have 3 comments on that more reflect on, you know, this, what to do with this and in which direction would all of that go, because the book and the discussions on child poverty come at a very important and right moment where globally discussions at the United Nations and its member states are happening about where to go after the MDGs, where to go after 2015. So there's a window of opportunity here, for example, to discuss about poverty. And so this book and the discussions come at the right time, but I think there's also a number of challenges if you read that book from this perspective, what to do with this. One is, I think, and I will be very brief here because we wanted to have time for discussion, simplicity. I mean, these child poverty measurements are complex. The one well-being index for well-being in Eastern Europe, for example, if you look at the book, has 8 dimensions, 24 components, and 51 indicators. Now, this is extremely hard to handle, particularly in the poor communities where the people and the authorities should be empowered with this type of knowledge to change the situation. So that's one challenge. Another one is, I think that we still, worldwide, need to develop better instruments to monitor, to collect data on children who are not in households. This is probably the most vulnerable group of all, but usually child measurement functions through household surveys. But that risks of missing out, particularly those groups who are not in households and so have the least protection. And the third challenge, I think, is a little bit the discussion started like this, and if you look at the book, child poverty versus income poverty. It's maybe natural that when a new paradigm evolves, that you kind of elbow yourself, against the big income and World Bank and whatnot. But the fact is that income poverty will remain the main indicator for measuring poverty. And so the question is whether we should, with the knowledge now, emphasize a little bit more in the complementarity and the added value of child poverty measurement. And the concrete question to Alberto and to New School, from my perspective, is, can we offer something, a kind of a simple additional indicator that complements the income poverty measurement? I mean, right now there's a window of 2 years where there will be negotiations on measurement of poverty. And this type of work now, I mean, what will it contribute to this? Will there be one indicator that complements income inequality or not? And I mean, I think this is now the time to take all of this important work and say whether we can complement what's going on and put something on the table. A second comment, a second set of comments has to do with the importance of local action. I mean, measurement or monitoring is not an end in itself, as a means to provoke changes in society, in how decisions are made, etc. And when you read the book, most of the policy use or recommendation has to do with macro-level policies. Our child poverty data have been included in the National Socio-Economic Development Plan, in the poverty reduction strategy for the country, in child budgeting discussion. But the fact of the matter is that the changes happen locally. And I think it is, and I think we will see increasingly in the next years, again, a much greater shift in international attention to local policy implementation and local conditions for implementation of policies, particularly when you talk about inequities. Now, you cannot have one without the other. That's also clear. This is a dynamic relationship. But the local matters. One brief example, in Colombia right now, after years and years of conflict, the government decided a big program and a law on land restitution. 6 million hectares stolen from the poorest. And guess what? The government is really behind that, the national government. But who kills and who threatens and who falsifies land titles are the local interest groups, so to speak. So I think, again, it is important now, if we look at child poverty measurement, to think of what can be done with this type of information locally. What do we really know about weak capacities locally to implement programs and policies, even to use this data? What are local power structures that start blocking progress? 2 minutes. So I'm going to my third comment, and that has to do with the issue of sustainability. Because obviously child poverty is a result of political neglect, often of discrimination, is It has roots. And I think one big weakness of the MDGs and the discussions around them was the lack of accountability of governments, really, to make the changes happen, particularly if it's for the most discriminated groups. And therefore, in a nutshell, I believe that there's a natural tendency when you talk about child poverty to look at government policies. But the complement to this is strategies and policies to strengthen citizenship, local participation, what we call mechanisms of accountability, ombudspersons type of organizations. I mean, I'm talking about worldwide. When we talk about human rights, we have often talked about global policies and we have talked about global principles. But I think we're now shifting towards the question, how can we empower organizational structures and organizations that make this happen? And I think that's another big challenge for us now, moving from the knowledge that we have into this implementation phase. And I very much hope that we can continue developing such an agenda, because it's here where we really need research, policy, and program implementation need to work together to really make the changes happening for children. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, I think we've had a really interesting set of comments and from the panelists and from the discussants. So let's open it up and collect a round of questions, and then we'll come back to the table. Are there any questions? Please.
Hi, my name is Emma Samaranza. I'm a former DCI student. I also work with Alberto and Equity for Children and currently working at UNICEF. I actually had two questions. One of them kind of for all of you, and probably maybe more for Sola. Regarding kind of this whole, what Alberto touched upon, the child participation aspect, which I also related to. You mentioned, Zola, the life satisfaction module that was introduced in the last version of the multiple indicator cluster surveys, that what I always wonder is, like, from your point of view, when we instigate programs where children are actually involved and their opinions and their definitions of poverty, for example, are asked, or we ask people about their life satisfaction level, is this information still being used? Because, for example, with the mix, I was actually just trying to find reports or places where this information on life satisfaction was actually used in a report, and I can't find it anywhere. It was obviously asked, but then to try to find like where did they actually do something with this, that's harder. And same with children's participation. From your point of view, how much is it kind of paying lip service to the fact that we are supposed to do it? And for example, UNICEF is mandated by the CRC to make sure that children are participating. But then I wonder, are there like good examples of children's participation actually leading to concrete changes? Did children's voices or opinions have an effect on new policies, or are you aware of any of these examples? And then my second question is maybe mainly to Kristen and Richard regarding the situation in the US. I myself am from Finland, so very often I annoy my American friends by starting sentences, well, in Scandinavia we do this, and in Finland you do that, when I'm, confronted with these horrible poverty figures or situation with education here or healthcare. And the answer that I very often get is that, well, that can't be replicated in the US because we're so big, or because of the difference between the state and federal, or because we're so heterogeneous that we can't agree the same way that, for example, Scandinavian countries can in terms of where to put your efforts and what kind of policies to implement to provide these minimum safety nets. And I'm wondering, is it a valid excuse? Like, is there a truth to the fact that it's hard to create these kind of, US level universal minimum safety nets? Because I don't think it is, but I'll very often find it hard to kind of, that's always thrown back at me that, it's obvious it's a very different situation because we are a country of farming people. But I'm wondering from your point of view, like where does the kind of legitimacy of that excuse end, and how can you, is there a truth to the fact that it is hard to implement this kind of educational healthcare protection policies on the US level because of the size and because of the federal state?
Thank you. Other questions? Yes? Right?
I usually don't need a microphone. I have a question. I have two questions as well. My name's Ashley. I'm with the Graduate Program for International Affairs. And I'm curious, mostly I have my notes here, mostly for Richard, for the first question, if you could elaborate a little bit about the constraints that the government imposes on nonprofits, especially, and their programs. You kind of touched upon it, but I'd like to hear a little bit more. And if you could maybe give us a couple of the top difficulties that you find that, and also maybe elaborate on how we can overcome them, if that's not too much. And then this might be more specific for you, but also for the other panelists. I'm interested in social innovation and social entrepreneurship, and I was wondering if there are any other third sector examples that we see of self-sustaining, proactive approaches to solving this problem of child poverty and also in child education. Thank you.
Thank you. Other questions? Yeah.
I just have one question, and it's stemming from something that you said about morality, the morality of prioritizing the needs of poor children over the needs of affluent countries. And I was wondering if any of the other panelists had any thoughts or reflections on the morality of serving the population of poor children in the world.
Thank you. Oh.
I'm Alan Hirschberg from the New School. A very interesting panel, and I didn't hear any mention of happiness. And I have a specific reason. I'm just wondering if any of the panelists want to comment on the recent rise of the concept of happiness as a replacement for GNP per capita, for a couple of reasons. One, if maybe it lends some helpfulness on a technical side, but two, because it's sort of a crack in the armor of these more economic measures. And so whether we like it or not as a concept, it does seem to maybe provide an opportunity to open a crack and slide some of these measures in behind it.
Thank you.
I
Usha?
have one question, just continuing what he said about the happiness. I saw in the presentation of Bhutan was shown as like 22% of children are not going into education. But Bhutan recently has come here and mentioned that on the happiness index is the top 1 countries, and next are the Scandinavian countries. So when it comes to the children's perspective, particularly voices, I read the quote what the child was saying, that I was unhappy, but now I'm happy with being a domestic worker. So how do we, when we are thinking of child well-being, how do we think of non-economic indicators which can be supported for, I would say, child's happiness?
Okay. Yeah.
Just following on, what about the issue of child disability measurement across countries? And I know the NYCS has put a disability module in, but there's a huge range which is hard to make sense of.
Right.
I'm curious, particularly from Christian, who has been in the States not very long, and Richard from you, or if anybody else has a comment as well about as global as the United States is, it's still very much sort of a United States versus the rest of the world in terms of a perception of the international community. And I wonder if you face that when you're talking to different audiences, and how you talk to people in the United States about the fact that it's not just, well, I care about the United States or I care about the international community, but we're actually part of the international community.
I'm Edie Bench. This is my last semester in GPIA. I have a master's in media. And for the last 5 years, I've been working with the homeless children in Rio de Janeiro. I teach them art, I help them and love them, and several of the children in my little films that I've made have been killed by brutality. And it always upsets me to go back there and see the disintegration of the children, the core group that I work with. I go to the orphanages, to the homeless shelters, and I work with the kids directly on my street in Rio. And my question is, isn't there a way that we can take these children's lives and the little films that I've done and the point that you bring up about how to change and what change has actually taken place that we can see that has made a difference. And the point that the gentleman from Children's Aid Society brought up of citing an actual example of a family situation, real names, real people. This seems to impact us so much more than numbers. I know when I recently went on the security jam with 113 countries that took place on the four-day online conference, I took a chance and submitted my Leandro's story, a little boy that I took home with me because he was crying and lost at midnight. A little boy that looked like he was only 5 years old, but who was actually 8. But he was so tiny because he was underfed. He lived in Benfica, the roughest slum in Rio, and in an abandoned warehouse. And I took him home and made it my point to find his mother. It turns out that this child had really been lost from his mother, but willingly. When we did find his mother 2 days later, I had to go to the police because I didn't want to be accused of taking a child. That this child runs away because he cannot stand the abandoned warehouse in which he lives. He cannot handle...
Can you get to the question?
Okay. He cannot handle the deprivation, the bullets spent, the blood, the drunken bodies. The question is, if this little child's life can be made known to the world, would that help? Would more of these children's stories help us understand how to get these kids some real moral help for their dreams? They want to stay alive. They care about their futures, and there doesn't seem to be any change. Just one last comment, Mike, if I may. I know that I'm very passionate about this, and I apologize. I do think that we have to find a way to make people pay attention, not just give lip service. When I've asked top people in Brazil about why the kids are being murdered every year, the homeless kids, you talk about them not having about measuring children in households, but what about the kids that live on the street? There are thousands. In Brazil, over 7,000 children were killed last year. There has to be a way for the government to really be accountable to answering. For instance, if when I've asked top-level officials, they say it's an embarrassment on the national level. So we hope that the states will handle it. And they also say that it's an embarrassment on the state level. We hope the municipal thing will handle it. My question again is, isn't there a way to get all kinds of societal upper-crust people involved in seeing these real children and seeing these real stories and seeing a real change as she talks about?
Thank you. Okay, Kiana, last question.
I have a question. Is there any data on youth from ages 18 to 24, that's the UN definition is of youth? Is there any data showing the effects of child poverty and the effects of employment and attainment?
Great, thank you. I think there are lots of questions, lots of comments. Maybe we can sort of go through the group in the same order that they spoke. Alberto, do you want to lead off?
Yeah, let me start. Thank you very much to all of you and the panel. Really a lot of ideas, a lot of things going in my head at the same time. Not very easy to answer, but I think that we have a challenge for the future. No, we are saying, look, here we have the evidence. It's clear, crystal clear. We need to do something. What we need to discuss what, because there's no only one thing that you can say, well, this is the bullet, the silver bullet. We hope to have something like that, no? Something like immunization against poverty, no? Something like if you can shoot and that's it. It's not like that. The societies, the people. So I really think that we need to move more. The idea of territorial action, local action, combine it with big policies. I think that this is something that we need to move. And I'm really, really glad that this panel, and you are here, and you mentioned also that this is a private organization, but now that the government is trying to do something, you can combine both things. And in my experience, from a long time working not only in measuring child poverty, but going there, going to the poor areas, working with the people, I think that you need to try to combine in some way legal action, policies, and very strong territorial definition and local actions. So in that combination, and a lot of awareness, and if you mix that kind of things, something can be done. If not, it's very, very difficult. So I think that there were many questions about participation. I think that there are examples. People is doing things. The energy of people doing things around the world is extraordinary. However, the energy of the others doing the opposite, is also extraordinary. So it's unclear how this will go, but we cannot continue like it is, no? So I pass to the other because...
Okay, thank you. Sora?
Yeah. Can you hear me? Yeah. Just want to touch upon, everyone was mentioning the participatory aspect. Emma's been looking for a life satisfaction module from the UNICEF multiple indicator cluster surveys. I think it was just added in the last round of mix, so we haven't still analyzed the last round of mix, so that's why you haven't found it. And the challenge is really what we're going to do with it, basically. You, me, Martin, Christian, or all my colleagues at UNICEF. So that remains to be seen in the year to come. And I think this is the new frontier for sure. We've always just been talking about in developing countries, some of the basic things children need to survive: education, health, nutrition, and so forth. And we always talk about them as, future generations. But we never think about just a good childhood here and now. That somehow doesn't apply to children in developing countries. And I think that's like the new frontier for UNICEF. So look forward to working on that together.
Thank you. Kristen?
Sure. I'll just comment on two of the questions. The one about are things possible in the United States given the size and so forth, and the happiness question. The first is, of course it's possible. The U.S. put people on the moon. The U.S. does all sorts of things. So if it wanted to do this, it obviously could. I was on a panel a few months ago, and one of the panelists said that she really thought that if public education didn't already exist today, like if you had to now create it, that it would never work, like that it would be impossible to get the country to agree, because right now the climate is so polarized. And it wasn't always like that, but right now it really is. It's very hard. This country is sort of at war over the role of government and the division between people who think everything is your personal responsibility, and then sort of everyone else who thinks maybe the government actually might have some sort of role to play. And it's very contentious, especially when it comes to children, because there are a lot of people who really believe that somehow they're children and are, theyrs, their responsibility, but also sort of theirs to raise as they see fit, and they don't want the state to interfere with that. And then there are a lot of other people who think that actually the state has a role to play in leveling the playing field and making sure everyone has the same choices and opportunities, or at least getting us closer there. So that's a really big battle right now, and it's very hard, stymieing a lot of progress. The times where we do have these big we do have kind of big policies that work, a lot of times it's a universal policy. So Social Security is a universal policy. Everybody gets it. Medicaid, a universal policy. Everybody gets it. So guess what? There's a lot of support for it. because it's not a program for those people over there. It's a program for all of us. So the more that we can have policies that benefit everyone, that we can sell as something that benefits everyone, the more likely they are to kind of get through. In terms of happiness, it's not that I'm against happiness or anything. I mean, happiness is great, but it's tricky, this question of happiness, because it really depends on how you measure it. You know, all these life satisfaction things, you know, sometimes they ask things like, are you happy with your life overall? So you might think, okay, I have healthy kids, you know, I have a good job, I can't complain. Yes, I'm happy. But then there are other ones that ask you, yesterday, did you cry? Did you feel that you were treated with respect? Were you sick? You know, and so you ask someone who has like a toddler who's having a tantrum and a newborn and a 5-year-old who's pitching a fit about something and she has a cold and, you know, I'm talking about myself a few years ago. No, I was thinking of my own self like 5 years ago. If you ask that person, even though the life satisfaction might be great, they'll be like, no, I'm miserable. I hate my life right now. So it's a tricky question. Is that person happy or are they not happy? You know, it's very tricky. And then also happy compared to what or compared to who? And there's the whole question of adaptive preferences. Like, are you just happy because you expect things to be really crummy, maybe, and things aren't so crummy now, so are you happy? And then there are a lot of counterintuitive findings, like some happiness studies showed, there was one in the United States, and it showed the happiest states were like Louisiana and Mississippi, and the most unhappy states were Massachusetts and Connecticut and New Jersey. Well, on our well-being index, Massachusetts and Connecticut and New Jersey are at the top, and Mississippi and Louisiana are at the bottom because, you know, they have the longest lives and they're earning the most money and they have the most education in those unhappy states. So as a policy-making tool, so what do you do then? Do you then invest in Massachusetts and New Jersey and Connecticut to make them happier, you know? Or like it's a puzzle. I mean, of course, happiness is the most important thing in the world, yet it's also, I don't know, is it? Like in terms of measurement or whatever? So I'm not, you know, such a fan of happiness.
So first of all, no amount of investments will make people in New Jersey happy. So let me, so just a couple of answers to a bunch of, those are all great questions. One, again, on the question about United States' size and diversity, it is an explanation but not an excuse. These things, as you just said, are all matters of political will. You know, so like here in New York City, I spend a lot of my time unintentionally becoming an advocate. You know, right now the mayor's preliminary budget would cut spending, would cut the number of slots for early childhood and after school from the height of the system in 2009 by 2/3. All right. So that's a really dumb idea for any number of reasons. It's dumb from a purely short-term economic perspective because working parents rely on our programs. They can't work or enter the workforce, so there's nowhere to send children. And it's dumb because investments in early childhood and after-school programs have a demonstrable impact on long-term economic gains of the children who attend them. But the reason why those cuts, or some version of them, and they've been cut every year for the last several years, is because of the policy decision of the mayor and the governor, and particularly the mayor, that increased revenue taxes are off the table. Because in his words, as I sat across from him and talked to him about this, his answer was that New York City's taxpayers are going to pay for more, are going to pay for that. We're not going to pay for those programs. But that's not true. They're not going to pay for it if leaders do. That's a judgment that people are making, and we give a society can make different judgments. Someone in the back asked about constraints on the nonprofit sector. So we don't have enough time. But I'll give you a couple. I mean, you know, a fundamental constraint are restrictions of money from foundations and governments, restrictions as to time and restrictions as to purpose, right? So if I have a $100,000 contract to provide after-school tutoring to a group of children for 1 year at this location in this way, right? And that's the way most government funding works. So these create all sorts of perversions. So the restrictions on time, first of all, the problems we're trying to address are not one-year problems. If I have a 4-year-old, you know, our ambition for our 4-year-olds is college graduation. That's an ambition we're not going to realize for some time. It's not going to realize it in a year. But if you have funding that is tied year to year, it leads to an over-reliance on year-to-year outcomes. It means that you can't really invest in capacity because you can't rely on funding coming back. And many funders have strict rules. We'll fund the program for 3 years and then we're out, regardless of the potential or possibilities of the program. restrictions on purpose, they can be so micromanaged that they undermine the entire reason to have a nonprofit provider in the first place. Because if we have a different idea about how to do things, we can't be nimble because we have to get permission to change what we're doing. Another perversion is just so most grants, particularly public grants, are line item reimbursement. So you get reimbursed for activities, you're not paid for results. So if I figure out a way to educate children in most systems, and there are exceptions to this, but in most public systems, or to do whatever it is, if I don't spend all my money within a particular period of time on pre-approved expenditures, that money goes back. So there's very little incentive to innovate, to be cost effective. I can't take the money that I might save by doing the job better and invest in better human resources or not physical plant or help in the bank and grow my endowment. You can't do that. So restrictions on time and purpose have all these very bizarre restrictions, and it's fundamentally a distrust between, our real problem is that we have two different customers. We have the customers who get the service and the people who are paying for them. People who are paying for them don't trust us and don't trust the people who are getting the service, fundamentally. So capital is very rigidly restricted in a way which lead to poor outcomes for everyone. And again, it has very little to do at the end of the day with the actual quality or the impact of what you're accomplishing. Another perversion is restrictions on overhead, which I mentioned briefly. New York State is exacerbating this right now because Governor Cuomo has proposed strict and rigid limitation on the amount of grants that can be spent on overhead, which, it'd be like telling Apple you can't spend money on research and development, only on manufacturing. Well, what are you going to manufacture? Like, nobody wants to pay for the lights. Nobody wants to pay for the rent or the cleaning, much less for program development or evaluation. But that's what overhead is. But government, in the name of saving taxpayer dollars, said that you can only spend 8% of your contract. In some cases, 2.6%. In some cases, most of our programs, frankly, are subsidized by private donors. The government doesn't even pay for the direct service, much less for the overhead of the organization. Someone asked about social entrepreneurship. There are tons of opportunities, and I won't go into them all. Tons of examples. We actually have a store on the Upper West Side called The Time for Children, which employs young people from our programs, and all the proceeds benefit the Children's Aid Society. It's not profitable. It loses money, but it does have a revenue stream. There are other examples. A great one is a friend of mine used to run for years called the Grayston Bakery in Yonkers, which produces all the brownies and Ben & Jerry's ice cream. It's owned by a nonprofit, but it's a for-profit business. It sells cookies and cakes and wholesale chocolates. There are examples of that. There are also new and innovative funding mechanisms. One that we've been enamored with is something called social impact bonds, which basically, I don't have time to get into it, but basically it's a way to get private investors to pay for social programs with a guarantee from government that if the programs work and save the government money, the government then reimburses the private investor. So it's a way of drawing new capital in, reducing some of the risks that government has of funding innovation, which government is not very well equipped to do, but focusing on results because the funders only get paid based on the impact, not based on the expense. And yes, stories matter. Stories matter a great deal, and all we do is tell stories. If you humanize what's happening in the communities where your neighbors live, if you humanize that 10 blocks from here, children are living in circumstances and families are dealing with challenges that none of us in this room can probably imagine, I do believe there's tremendous power in stories.
Thanks very much. Sanjay?
Well, I think we're running a bit over time, and I've probably said what I have to say more or less. So maybe, if there is a minute, I'll just add just a very quick thing, which is, first of all, on the question of happiness. Of course, there's large discussion, Alec, about this in philosophy and in welfare economics. And as you know, one of the key issues there concerns objective versus subjective assessment. And the difficulty with children in particular is that the bases for discrimination or judgment as to what it is that constitutes one's own well-being might be even more questionable than in the case of adults. Of course, even in the case of adults, there can be arguably, sometimes a gap between subjective and objective well-being. And that problem is much more acute, one would think, for a variety of reasons in the case of children. It would be interesting to see what John Stuart Mill, for instance, has to say about this, given his interest in this question, and the fact that he believed, he did make a case for intervening paternalistically, it's not an accident we use that word, in relation not only to the lives of children, but also colonized people who are not capable of their own self-governance and others. So I think it would be interesting to go into that and see what we could draw from it. But the basic point really is that happiness, certainly as assessed in surveys and other such rough measures, wouldn't seem to be sufficient for attacking some of these deeper questions. On the question of child disability, I think that this is a very important issue for which the existing child poverty surveys are not equipped. And one of the reasons they're not equipped, child poverty measures, and I'm afraid this applies both to the UNICEF Bristol approach and the approach championed by Sabina Alkire and her co-author in this book, Roche, which is that they're really indifferent to correlations between different kinds of deprivations, which is quite ironic because the whole point of taking into account multidimensionality of deprivation is to take note of the correlations. If somebody suffers from 2 deprivations, then presumably that makes it worse for that person than, or from let me put it this way, from a population-wide point of view, we might want to take account of 2 deprivations concentrated in one person differently from those 2 deprivations distributed across 2 different people. There could be an argument that certainly in the case of certain deprivations, it's much worse to have those concentrated in one person. So let me give a very straightforward example of this. A physical disability combined with income poverty might be worse for a variety of reasons than a physical disability that from the point of view of the society, than a situation in which there's a person who has a physical disability but isn't income poor, and a person who is income poor. Now, neither is a pretty situation. I'm not saying that either is a pretty situation. But if we're going to do an assessment of the situation of the society, we may want to take note that a person who is physically disabled may have additional needs which require additional resources, public and private, in order to reach a certain threshold of adequacy. And these measures don't necessarily do that. Many other questions to mention, but there's no time, so let me stop.
Thank you. Christian?
We'll briefly relate to the question of the relationship between the U.S. and the world and how this is seen, and just to remind ourselves that the world has dramatically changed in the past decades. That how we look at it today, the traditional relation between donor or recipient isn't there anymore. The number of middle-income countries has clearly skyrocketed, and the number of children. And so I think this unilateral or power where the U.S. or even the West is kind of giving the direction, I wouldn't say it isn't there anymore, but it has faded quite strongly. And so the countries, as we see this in different programs, are not necessarily anymore looking at what is the U.S. doing, particularly not in the children's field. So for example, I mean, what I perceive is that people are quite actually shocked when they learn how low social transfers and how inefficient social transfers are in the U.S. towards children compared to, for example, Scandinavian countries. Or the education, the results in education. I mean, this is not like the country you want to learn from, maybe from the failures, but not. On the other side, the U.S. is still very strong on health technologies, clearly, and also early childhood care and development. A lot, other countries look to learn here. So I guess the general trend is that there is growing demand now for innovations and for application of new forms of social technologies in the world, but the country look at, wherever they can get it. And I'm maybe saying something a bit controversial. For example, Iran's success in reducing infant mortality rate or in the fight against HIV is an example to many Islamic countries where they look, to get knowledge from Iran rather than, for example, for the US, Cuba, another favorite country here, where early childhood care and development is, something that the Cubans send advisors all over the world. So I guess we're seeing really a much more horizontal type of exchange of knowledge about children, and I think it is important to be clear and to what's the niche when talking about the US. What is the niche of like cutting edge research and science and experience on children, and then the universities still have the big names here, have power in the global knowledge structure, and then try to network this, but also learn from others. I don't know whether that explains your question, but that's the way how I see it or how I perceive it.
Thank you very much. I think we've really had a terrific round of questions, and I think we ought to leave a little bit of time to celebrate the book. There's some wine and there's some food, and I'd just like to congratulate everybody for this. I'd also like to say that excellent efforts in intellectual leadership like this, it's impossible for one person to do that. And I think that this work is obviously a work of partnership, and I think that the whole Equity for Children team that's here is also a major supporter, and it's very evident. So I'd just like to congratulate everybody participating in this work. Thank you very much.